about downsizing. So they're separate talks, but they're all connected kind of under that whole term of downsizing, which isn't a great term, as we talked about last week. So it's one of the few that we have. I myself am going for the third act rather than downsizing. So just to give this some perspective, last week's talk was a little bit more esoteric. We were kind of talking about some of those inconvenient truths, which is change is inevitable. We're all going to the same place sooner or later. None of us gets out alive, right? And we can't take it with us. So those, and there were others. And then we had one convenient truth, which is that we've all been through life transitions before. And somehow, even though we didn't know all the answers up front, it might have felt like we were kind of taking a step into the abyss a little bit. Somehow we made it and through it. And every transition involves your trade-offs. You're getting something, maybe you're giving something up. It's a compromise that you make internally with yourself in your lives. And so I redid my terrible drawing here, and just again, the way I think about this, home. We're here talking about our home, and home for all of us is mainly two things. It's our largest asset, and for most of us, and especially after Silicon Valley Bank issue earlier this week, and Credit Suisse, I think, today. But it's also, complicated because home is also the centering place for our lives. And all those things that resonate emotionally and psychologically with us, privacy, security, comfort, safety, we connect all those things to home. And so when you add up largest asset and centering place, that can push a lot of buttons, a lot of emotional buttons around it, because it's a big thing. And if you think about it, almost every home that people sell or buy or whatever is a subset of a larger life transition that they're making. So why do people buy and sell homes? Well, they get married, they want a bigger home, they have kids, they need a bigger home, they get a job transfer, they change homes, they have success at work, they get a bigger home, they get divorced, they split homes, all those things, big life transitions. So we're talking about downsizing, or the third act, which is, kind of that last big shift between the first 2/3 of our lives and the last third of our lives. And it's a complicated mix of stuff. It triggers a lot of stuff. It's hard to figure out. So what we're trying to do through these talks is make a start at creating some kind of a map, because there is none. There's no instruction manual. We can't plug in the GPS coordinates on Waze and get there. So, and each of us is unique in our own lives. And so each of us has to create our own map, but there are some similarities for all of us. And the idea is to not have to reinvent the wheel, but if that we can borrow from someone else who's had success, and that sounds like a good idea for us, we want to be able to do that. So the idea is that we're looking for a map. I think Bernard had a great idea the other day, which first you need a compass. So you need a direction first, north, south, east, or west. And in order to, so once you have a direction, general direction, then you need to create a map. But for us in this downsizing transition, it's like the map is right now it's a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces. There's so many of them, and it's hard to create the map unless you really understand the pieces of the map. And then once you do, you can start to fit them together in the map of your choosing, the one that looks the best for you and works. So tonight we're going to concentrate on the asset section of the map, because those are big things and they often trigger the other side of the map. All those worries about, will I outlive my retirement? Am I going to have health care? All those things are also connected with the asset side. So we've got great guests tonight, Tom Castillo and Alan Wind and you can tell that they're here to talk about capital gains because they have the suits on, and that I told them to do that because it instills a sense of confidence when your CPAs wear suits. It means
they're not wearing any ties.
Well, that was that was because we're in Santa Cruz, and CPAs in Santa Cruz don't wear ties.
So they don't look like lawyers.
That's right. And realtors stopped wearing suits a long time ago. So they're gonna talk about capital gains, which is one of those big things that affect the value of your asset, and that we all have to think about if we're making a shift in the future. And then they're going to go through their talk, and then we'll do questions afterwards. It's too easy to go down the rabbit hole of if somebody has an individual question that's very unique to them. If we kind of stop in the middle, we're going to find ourselves down the rabbit hole, and that's not productive for everybody else. So we're going to ask that you hold your questions till the end of their talk, and then once they're finished, then our own Dax Nolenberger is going to launch on and tell us a little bit more about Prop 19, how that works, where it came from, how it developed, and some of the recent changes. And then we'll also do questions there. And Tom and Alan can also help answer the questions about Prop 19. And then if we have more time at the end, I'll talk about some other things that I think would be helpful for you. Does that sound good? Yeah. And I'm glad to see so many faces from last week here. I was a little worried that we might have laid it on a little bit heavy. There was one person who was a little angry afterwards, and she said, "I'm 75. I don't need people reminding me how old I am or that I'm going to die." And of course, she was on the virtual thing, so I, if she had been here and had some of the fine wine that we're serving, maybe that would have all smoothed out a little bit. And for those that are on the virtual link, if you want to type questions into the chat thread, we're happy to ask those at the appropriate time. And you're really missing a good group here. There's a safety and a great feeling when you're sitting around like-minded people who are talking about the same thing. But I understand. So without further ado, Tom and Alan are going to take it over, and they've got a PowerPoint to go along with their presentation.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Tom Castillo. Great to be here today with you guys. My colleague over here, Alan Wynn. I want to thank the Brezsny team for having us here today. Like Tom mentioned, we're going to be talking today about taxes specifically related to selling your home, right? So I'm going to try to get through this at a decent pace. So I'm going to try to be thorough as well. Alan's going to try to back me up if I say things that don't make sense, which tends to happen when I talk about the tax code, and I'll try to keep you guys awake, but I won't hold it against you if you nod off. This isn't the most exciting topic for everybody. I'm going to see if get this right. Works? Okay. Perfect. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I mean, the big thing is capital gains taxes, the basic calculation of capital gains taxes with your home. Also, some of the rates you're going to run into, some of the nuances that come up when you talk about how you calculate the gain on your home as well. We're going to touch down on the estate tax. There's not a whole lot of people in general, as a percentage of the population that have estate tax problems. I'll go over that. But it ties in nicely to the capital gains piece as well. Dax is going to take over Prop 19. I had a slide for that, but I'm just going to skip over that. And then I'll get into some of the more interesting techniques for folks that have large gains in their property that they might want to take advantage of. Most of them, there's a trade-off in terms of either, pain in the neck or, risk, things of that nature. Okay, so capital gains, I think this is a pretty intuitive calculation for most people. You're going to have the sales price, in this case of your home, your primary residence. You're going to have the selling expenses, so that's commissions paid to realtors, that's title insurance, things like that. Everybody's been to title, I think. So you have all those expenses come off the cost of the home, things like staging as well. And then you have, I think, the piece that can be a little more confusing is cost basis. So you take sales price, you subtract the selling expenses, and you subtract cost basis to get to your taxable gain. This is the case for any asset, really any capital asset. So whether it's stock in your portfolio, whether it's a rental property, this is the calculation to get to your gain. What's unique about primary residences, and I think a lot of people know about this already, is this Section 121 exclusion. You might not know the formal name, but it's the $250,000 exclusion that comes off the top of your gain. So if your gain is $300,000 and you're a single filer, they're going to give you $250,000 of that tax-free. They're only going to tax you on $50,000. Married filers get $500,000, so it doubles for married filers. And that's kind of one of the biggest nuances to selling your primary residence. A long time ago, I think before my time, prior to 1986, which is the year I was born, there used to be some sort of rollover of your primary residence. You know, and some people still think that's the case. That's not the case. This is really the only thing that's available, maybe with a couple of different exceptions to avoid capital gains on the sale of your primary residence. Any questions?
On a reverse mortgage, does the amount that we have borrowed on the reverse count in what direction on there?
It doesn't factor into basis. So reverse mortgage is just like cash out refinance on your property, something to that effect. So it's just going to add to the debt and it'll have to be paid off, but it doesn't factor into the basis. I'll go into the the actual calculation of basis real quick. Yep, go ahead.
If by chance you're moving up in value and changing houses, can you still do a 1031?
No, but maybe. I'll go over that at the end.
And then you can add in your improvement.
Correct. Yeah, I'm going to get into the actual calculation of cost basis right here. So the cost basis includes the purchase price of your home, of course, right? So, and that even includes things on your escrow statement. I mean, if you really need to nickel and dime it, you know, title insurance, things like that, those go into cost basis. And then you add in major improvements, right? Additions to your home. You added a new roof, remodels, construction, retaining walls, things of that nature, fences. So a lot of folks, I mean, I have plenty of clients that have purchased their property in the 90s, you know, maybe for $250,000, and it's now worth $1.5 million, but they've put in a lot of money over the years, right? So a lot of times we're able to add up enough improvements with the help of the 121 exclusion that they're paying very little in the way of tax. It excludes ongoing maintenance and repairs. If you have a plumber come and you know, snake your toilet, or you know, you have paint's a big one that you know, that's a big cost usually. That's technically not an addition to basis unless it's part of an overall remodel. So you add up all these things, your purchase price and your improvements and everything else. The things you have to subtract that people don't really think about are any depreciation that you've taken on the home. Depreciation is a tax concept, usually reserved for rentals or business use of home. Sometimes people depreciate their home. It's a non-cash expense that the IRS allows you to take against your property. Those are deductions from your cost basis, and those actually have to be recouped. How the IRS actually tracks that, I have no idea. I don't think that they really do, to be honest with you, especially if it's just a business use of home. You know, you take a few $1,000s of depreciation over the years. If you have a CPA who's pretty thorough, they're going to pick up on it, especially if you've worked with them for a long time. The other thing is casualty losses, specifically like uninsured casualty losses. There's this thing called the tax benefit rule. So let's say, for instance, you had an uninsured shed on the property that got taken out by a mudslide. It was $100,000. You deduct that on your tax return as a casualty loss. The IRS isn't going to allow you to double dip and count that in your basis as well, right? So the theory being that you rebuild the shed. This doesn't really pertain to insurance reimbursements because there's a whole different set of laws there. Insurance reimbursements are more or less ignored unless there's a taxable gain. I won't get into all that right now. But those two things are subtractions from your basis. And then another nuance for folks that have been divorced is that your basis is actually from your purchase price while you were married. So even if you, like if you and your spouse purchased a property for $200,000, time goes on, your property's worth $1 million now, you get a divorce and you have to pay the spouse out for whatever their fair value is, you actually don't get any addition to basis for that. You just, there's no changes to tax attributes incident to a divorce. So that's something that I think surprises some folks when I talk to them. They say, hey, you know, I got a divorce, I had to pay out a big chunk of money. You know, that's just painful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's not fun news to deliver. Go ahead. Yes, yes. And I'll get into that right after. It's the last point. You probably can't see up there, but I'll touch on step up in basis. The other thing is gifted property. So if you have a gifted property, let's say your parents gave you a property and they bought it for $36,000 back in 1960, you know, they gave it to you in 85, it was worth 300 grand then, you still get the $36,000 basis from 1960. So gifted property gets carryover basis, which is the gift doors basis. And then to touch on your point, there's such a thing as step up in basis, right? So if you hold, the title matters in this instance, but most people in California hold their title in community property or through a trust in community property. And when in a community property, when one spouse passes away, the full property gets a step up in basis. So what a step up in basis is, it's like your new purchase price, basically. Everything, all your additions prior to that, all your purchase price prior to that, wiped completely clean. You go out to an appraiser like Nicholson or one of the appraisers in town. They appraise the property as of the date of death. And at that point, you're going to have your new purchase price. Any additions after that, those can be added to basis, but that's essentially how that works. The theory behind that, and I'll get into this in estate tax law, at least the way I've made sense of it, is all this, everything that you inherit is quote unquote taxable, but there's these large exclusions, right? These lifetime exclusions, similar to the 121 exclusion, where we say, hey, this is a taxable event. However, we're not going to tax you on it, right? So everything that's been quote unquote taxed, even if there was no tax to pay, is going to be stepped up to its fair market value. Is that everything there on that slide? Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Go ahead.
There's a 2 out of 5 year rule.
Correct. That's that 121 exclusion. Good question. I think
there's an ownership and use test, right? For 121 applies to your primary residence. So as long as you've lived there and owned it for 2 of the last 5 years as your primary, then you're qualifying for that.
Perfect. Yeah.
121.
Exactly. That's the 255.
250 is single, yeah, married.
So that's 2 out of the last 5 years, but it doesn't have to be consecutive. It's just 2 years out of the.
Correct. Yeah. So sometimes people snowbird, you know, between 2 houses, but you can't take it. You can't take it in succession. You can't take one tax year after the next. Every 2 years you can take it.
Yeah, clock starts over.
Yeah. So in theory, you could get both houses if you play it right. This is just a quick slide to talk about, and I think I already touched on this, improvements versus maintenance, routine maintenance, landscaping, routine painting. That's maintenance not added to basis, adding systems, new windows, new roof, things like that. Ground improvements is big, you know, fences, paving, pools, of course. Remodels and additions.
Adding value, right?
Yeah, exactly. If it's adding value, is a big component.
Solar panels?
Solar panel, great question. Solar panels, yes. Getting back to that tax benefit rule, let's say we put $50,000 in solar panels with that 30% credit, we get a $15,000 federal credit. So we have to reduce the basis addition by that $15,000. So 50 minus that $15,000 credit, you can add $35,000 to your basis. Well, hopefully you did, but then you wouldn't have to reduce it by the credit. Yeah. Good questions though. The 121 exclusion we were talking about just a minute ago. This is the slide we have for that. So, and I apologize for bouncing around. The slides are a little funny in the way they're ordered, but essentially this is that $250,000, $500,000 exclusion for married filers, right? So if you calculate your gain on this on the sale of your primary residence after you factor in your basis and your selling price, and your selling expenses, you have your gain, and then you get to take up to, which is an important distinction, up to $250,000 or $500,000 if you're married. That means, you know, if you have a let's say you had a $300,000 gain and you get a $500,000 exclusion, you don't get to take a $200,000 loss. It's just up to that amount. So that's a big distinction. And to Alan's point, there's the ownership test and the use test, right? So you have to own the house and use the house. Sometimes you get people, you know, call the office, hey, well, I have a second home, and I haven't really been living with my girlfriends. Can I qualify? I say, well, no, but what's the likelihood you get caught? That's a different story. Go ahead. Beg your pardon? Use is living in the property. Well, again, back to Tom's point. I mean, you can split days. Yeah, you can split. They count days basically. Yeah. So, but that's a good question. I'm sure there's a better definition of use that I can get back to you on. But my understanding is essentially that you're living in it.
What are the unforeseen circumstances?
That's a good question too. So the 2-year rule is something that we run into a lot, and maybe this isn't the case for folks in the room that have large appreciation, but during the COVID years, sometimes we've had this really accelerated depreciation or appreciation in a property. And I was talking to a friend the other day. She's not a client. She struggles with depression sometimes. She moved up to the valley. She's under a lot of trees, and she says, this really isn't going well for my mental health. I want to sell, but I haven't been in here in 2 years. So I said, oh, don't worry. That's an unforeseen circumstance. You get a doctor's note. There's a safe harbor, and we can prorate the gain. So what that means, just to not use too many of the same numbers, let's say that she were in there, 60% of 2 years, she would get a 60%, her and her husband would get a 60% prorated deduction. She could take a $300,000 exclusion. And, she thought that she was going to be in a situation, she'd had so much appreciation that she was going to have a taxable event. She was happy to hear that. Other unforeseen circumstances, employment, losing your job, getting a new job in Los Angeles, things like that. Not everything's codified. Unforeseen circumstances, whatever qualifies is going to be facts and circumstance based, but there is some things that are codified like health and change of employment, and some safe harbors, which means like if you do X, then nobody's going to question it. And one of those is a physician's note.
Disaster as well. Right, good.
Oh yeah. If there's something.
Yeah, the home is destroyed.
Yeah, the home's destroyed. You'll be okay.
Yeah.
I'll let you take the game on that. So, and then one thing I always hear, this is kind of one of those water cooler conversations about this 121 exclusion, is that, I have this rental property and I've had it since such and such time. And I talked to my CPA or my tax preparer or my buddy and his CPA, and they said, if I just move into the property for 2 years, I can sell it and I can get that $500,000 exclusion. While that may have been true, they caught on to that in 2008. And that ever since 2008, they've made you prorate a ratio between the periods of what they call qualified, which would be, using it as your primary residence, and non-qualified use, which would be renting the property. So every year since 2008, that ratio gets worse and worse. Just to make the math simple, let's say that you were in it for 2 years in 10. You rented the property for 8 years, you moved in for 2 years. The ratio there is 2 and 10, 20%. The maximum you can get if you're married is $100,000, 20% of that $500K. So that's why I say, that's one of those things where this is one of those things that's a little bit, I don't think quite as much, but it's one of those bad pieces of tax advice that's been going around quite a bit. Converting a primary residence to a rental, we'll get into that in a little bit, and that goes into your 1031 question from earlier. Any questions on that? Go ahead, Tom.
Occasionally we'll come across a situation where partners have been living in a house for a fairly long time, let's say 5 years, but they're not married. and only one of them is on the title. And so the question becomes, oh gosh, we're going to sell the house, they both been living there. Can we stick that second person on title, a week before we sell the house and get the exclusion?
It's a good question. Only one spouse has to meet the ownership test. But since they're not married, my inclination is to say that because they're not married, they won't qualify. Whether there's some sort of exception in the code for domestic partnerships or something that they could do something in California law, maybe, but generally speaking, they'd have to go to the courthouse and tie the knot. Is my understanding.
And one other question. Oftentimes, we're talking to people who are going through the downsizing process, and they've got boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff in the garage. And somewhere within those are receipts from 20 years ago about some significant capital improvement they made on their house. Sometimes they have them, sometimes they don't, sometimes it's partial. How closely do those, how good do those receipts need to be in order to raise the basis?
Yeah, great question. And I promised Terry I'd touch down on that and I skipped it in the slide. So thanks for reminding me. So I've been in practice for about 10 years in Santa Cruz. Probably sold, I don't know, hundreds, maybe even close to 1,000 primary residences or rental properties. Never have I ever seen the IRS audit basis. Does that mean they won't do it in the future? Usually the IRS has these programs, they kind of hone in on something. This is an area of abuse. We're going to start honing in on that. For whatever reason, that's not something they're honing in on right now. What we do at our practice is to say, if you spent the money, I don't care if you can find the receipt or not, I would throw it on your tax return. We can cross that bridge later, but there's no reason why, if you spent $80,000 on a remodel in '93 because you can't find the receipt, that you shouldn't put it on your tax return. Yeah, so if you can't remember it's 80 or 100, maybe you want to err on the side of conservatism and say 80, 85, 90. But yeah, there's a lot of estimates, documentation, and a lot of tax court cases will, the judge will kind of err whether or not someone's believable in their estimates, and they will allow estimates at times. Certainly better if you have the documentation.
Tom, what about if your box was flooded?
Oh, I think it's the same boat. This comes down to.
You do.
Yeah, I would try to do it like memorialize it. Write something down. Maybe get it notarized. Anything that's more believable if you have to go to tax court. Yeah, great questions though. We talked a lot about the calculation of tax, how you get to that gain number. We haven't talked about the rates yet. And the rates, there's a little bit of, there could be some confusion about the rates as well, particularly capital gains rates. So first and foremost, when you sell a home, it's not ordinary income, it is capital gains tax, right? So it falls in that bucket of capital gains, and capital gains has a special treatment. A lot of people think it's bad. It's actually favorable treatment. Capital gains is favorable treatment on the federal side. California says, I don't care what it is, capital, ordinary, we tax it the same. So federal, it's a good thing. So capital gains rates are kind of funny, especially since the introduction of the net investment income tax, which is this Obamacare related tax from the law passed in like 2013 or something to that effect. But basically it starts at 0%. And you get 0% up. This is for married filers. You get 0% up to about 90 grand, and then you bump up to 15%. You get 15% up to about 500 grand, and then over and above 500 grand, you pay 20% capital gains taxes. Now you throw in the net investment income tax, and they kind of blend rates for you a little bit. They add this 3.8% Medicare tax on top of the capital gains tax. So in effect, you really have a 0% rate, you have a 15% rate, and then because the 3.8% rate kicks in at $250,000 for married filers, $200,000 for all other filers, then you're going to get a situation where you have an 18.8% rate and then a 23.8% rate. So what does this all mean when we talk about rates and everything else? I mean, California doesn't really have a rate. So, you know, they're between 9.3 on average and 9.3 to 11.3, usually up to about $1 million in gain, you know, high $900,000. So good sort of estimate. You know, I say about a third. So if your gain is 300,000, then you're probably going to have to pay about 100,000. For primary residence, it's probably going to be a little bit lower. The reality is, a lot of times we're doing these calculations and these estimates for folks that have rental properties and they have depreciation, and there's special laws for the depreciation that you take against your ordinary income and your rental income. They say, hey, we want to recapture that at less favorable rates than capital gains rates. We don't want to give you that sort of tax rate arbitrage. So it winds up being an even more blended rate and less favorable. So maybe 30%, even high 20s for the sale of a primary residence after you take into account the 121 exclusion. So just your taxable gain.
What about an ADU that's been added to the property?
That's basis. Is that what you mean?
Well, how would it affect the
Oh,
tax rate?
well, it would depend if you're renting the ADU. It would be the same concept. So let's say you spend $300,000 on the ADU. You start depreciating it. You know, it's about $10,000 a year. You know, you do that for 10 years. Now your adjusted basis is going to be 300 minus that depreciation of $100,000, and you will have recapture rates if you've been recording that rental. So that's a good question, though. One of the misconceptions I get with capital gains is, well, you know, I'm living off my Social Security. You know, my taxable income is zero. If I sell my property for $1 million, I get that 0% rate, right? Not the case. That each dollar of capital gains actually serves to fill up that rate as well. So you might get 0% rate on the first, you know, 40, 50, 60, $70,000 in gain. You add up all your ordinary income and your capital gains. So it's a little convoluted, but no, you won't. I mean, you might get a better rate overall, but it's not going to be by much. So that's one of the misconceptions there about cap gains. Any questions on cap gains?
Yeah, so because California doesn't have capital gains, so that means you don't get a minus 500,000.
Oh, they do conform to the 120 exclusion. They just don't have a favorable rate.
Okay.
But good question. Yeah.
Are you going to give a couple of examples so we can kind of visualize
Yeah.
and see what this actually looks like?
Yes, ma'am. So these are some pretty basic examples. You know, I just wanted to go through and just kind of give you an illustration, right? You have your sales price on the left of 1.6 million. In this case, they paid $500,000. The cost basis, I lumped it all together, right? So they may have bought it for 300 and put $200,000 in improvements. The point is their cost basis is $500,000 after their selling expenses, which we usually project at about 6% for sales of real property. That's $96,000. Their gain is just above $1 million there, $1.4 million. You can subtract, as a marriage filer, you can subtract that $500,000 exclusion, get a taxable gain of $504,000. And we ran this through our estimated tax calculator. This would be for a lower income person, meaning maybe they're living off lower taxable income. Maybe they're living off Roth IRAs, Social Security, things like that. And their rate, I think it wound up being about 28%. So it was about $141,000. Example number 2, this is kind of your ideal situation. Their cost base is $800,000. Their sales price, I should start with, is $1.3 million. Cost base is $800,000. Subtract the selling expenses. You have your gain, $422,000. Your 121 exclusion is up to $500,000. So that zeroes everything out. You're out of the woods, tax free. Any questions? Those are the 2 examples I have, but they're very simple.
I want to ask a question now from a slide, a couple, when you mentioned the one about if the spouse, if there's death, have a new cost basis.
Correct.
And I was thinking, wait, I think that's advantageous because
100%.
So even though it might have been the example 1, that if a spouse passed away, your actual cost basis would be way higher because it would go to the value of that house now.
100%. Yeah, you would get a much higher tax basis. You'd have a much less taxable gain. So I tend to joke. I tend to be a little cynical with tax practice, but I see a lot of clients that build up real estate, mini real estate empires. They have all these, and they don't want to sell their property because they don't want the tax event. But, you know, I kind of joke with them, well, you're buying real estate for your kids because you might have $15 million in real estate. You pass away, everything will get stepped up and they're going to sell it all. So they don't always wind up doing that, but it's just me being cynical, I guess. Sure.
That's only if the property is listed in community, title, community property.
Yes.
If it's joint tenant, what happens?
Half of it will get stepped up sometimes. If you hold the property in joint tenancy, it's going to depend. Usually half the property will get stepped up. The other half won't. It's depends quite a bit. I mean, if you go through the other examples, sometimes you'll have separate property. Somebody inherited the house, was gifted the house. If that spouse dies, 100% of that property will step up. But if that spouse is the one that remains living, then there's going to be no step up. So, but good question.
The community property or
Both of it, yeah.
In a year where you have a significant capital gain exposure, and that, if you're on a fixed income and have some disability or Medicare payments, can that take you out of a certain bracket and cause you to lose some of your government sponsored?
Yeah, and I wish my business partner were here because he's the expert on that. But so there's a couple things that can happen. So your Medicare tax, there's Medicare tax brackets, right? So there's sort of these bands of Medicare. If you go above certain AGI, I think they do like a 2-year look back, and they're going to say, hey, we're going to bump up your Medicare premiums. People say, hey, they lowered my Social Security. Well, they did. They lowered the amount of money they're depositing into your account, but Social Security is the same. They're just pulling out more from Medicare. And I believe you can get that, you can petition to get that waived if it's a one-time event, like the sale of a house. And some other programs, you might be able to petition to get it waived as well. There's also some techniques where, this is getting a little bit out there. But there's some folks that'll gift property to children in order to qualify for asset-based aid. Particularly, I think, like mental health or what do you call it, memory care, things like that. And then there's this weird piece of the tax code. You'd have to talk with a trust attorney about this because I'm gonna forget the name. But essentially, where it's this old law where people would give stuff away, but they'd retain the benefit of its use. And back when the estate tax exemptions were much lower, they try to pull that back into the estate and say, hey, you retain use. Well, now that's kind of flipped on its head, and they say, okay, well, we gifted it to our daughter, we qualify for this aid, or our son, or whoever, we qualify for this aid now, and we use that same technique to pull that property back into the estate and get the step up in basis and kind of have the best of both worlds. I really wish I remembered that right now, but I'll try to follow up with an email. Kind of lost my train of thought. You go ahead.
So is the difference if you're not married, is it the 121 exclusion or how does it?
It's 250,000.
All right, so that's the only place it impacts that example.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing regarding step up in basis, if you have rental properties that I just want to touch down on real quick, is that you're going to get a step up in basis and it'll wipe your depreciation clean and you'll start over on your depreciation, which is a really big deal because you're going to go from usually a married filing joint status to a single status, which is less advantageous. So you're going to need those additional deductions. So you'll need those date of death appraisals to reset the rental depreciation. Go ahead.
Is there any time limit how soon you have to be married to get the benefit?
No, you can do it on your deathbed. Yeah, seriously. They were worried about, and I'll get into the estate tax stuff in a little bit, but they were worried about these deathbed marriages because of this new concept of portability that's been introduced since I think 2013. It hasn't been a big thing though. That's word.
I was gonna say before you left that slide.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, example of married. So I'm starting with the cost basis of the house. Cost basis of the house, what you paid for it, in my case, 30-something years ago, plus remodel. That's your 500,000. Now you've got your sale price, 1,600. And then you've got your expenses, the, real estate commission and everything else, and whatever else you spent in that. So that's, gain is that 1,004,000. Then you get your exclusion if you're married. So then you're saying taxable gain is 504,000. And are you saying out of that taxable gain, which is kind of what's left, you're gonna pay $141,000 in tax?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Get married.
So about a third. I think that's about 29%. Is that surprising? I mean, it's because it's
spending the money.
yeah. I mean, there's usually some outs. I mean, usually when you talk through it, and maybe I would talk with you after and kind of pick up on your facts and circumstances. Sometimes it is that bad.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of like a true scenario. So I'm like, whoa. I mean, that's why a lot of us are here. Like, well, that's sobering. That's good to know, because you won't know it unless you learn it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just want to understand that that's what I was understanding.
One of the things we talk about a lot is the fact that you're in this position to pay this tax because you made great decisions about buying real estate and you realized fabulous appreciation and you did all the right things to maintain your house. It's like a golden goose. It gave you 12 eggs and you got to give one back. But we see a lot of people stay in place because they have an allergy to pay any tax at all, even though they're miserable. And if you can, part of what we talked about last week is changing your belief system. If you switch that equation and say, look at this windfall of money, I am such a smart individual, and take some of the pain out of paying a little back. So it's important thing to wrestle with.
Absolutely. And I've got some slides for you later too.
This is just the federal side of it, right?
No, I combined them there. That's both. Yeah. Federal and state.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
What if the title is in a trust?
Usually there's a provision in the trust that says whatever title it went into, it retains whatever title it was in, it retains, or there's a transmutation. You'd have to talk, which is a fancy term for it turned into community property. So you'd have to talk to your trust attorney. A lot of these title issues, I know enough to be dangerous, but I always say, go talk to your attorney because I don't want the
Well, I was going
liability.
to say the trust was I was married and my husband died, and the trust was changed to be just me
Right.
as a trustor.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm married to somebody else. Does that count? Should I sell my house, let him sell his house or whatever?
Yeah.
Would we be considered married and be able to take the 500,000?
So step up in basis upon the death of your first spouse, right? And then only one spouse needs to meet the ownership test if both you are living in that property. So you would get the $500,000. Yeah. So good questions. Yeah.
If the title is husband and wife and both tenancy right of survivorship, how does that?
I still think it's only 50%, but I can get back to you on that one. Usually it's got to be community property to get the step up on both sides. A good question.
And you have to have that appraisal done when the spouse dies?
You don't have to have it done right away. You can actually go back and have a post or a predated, backdated appraisal. Yeah, exactly. So you just call it appraisal.
You can do retroactive.
Yeah.
Couple of years back. Yeah. Some trust attorneys are okay if it's just more or less a market analysis by a qualified real estate person rather than full appraisal. Different trust attorneys feel differently about it.
Yeah. We definitely prefer the appraisal, especially if it's for rental properties but it's their return. They sign off on it. The estate tax is something we can touch down on real quick. Like I said before, most people aren't subject to the estate tax. If you are, good for you. It's $13 million per person, right? So this was initially brought, I think in 2013, there's all these tax laws that passed between Obamacare and I think the chopping block, there was a chopping block, the $3.5 million exemption. And then in a surprise move, they had passed the $5 million exemption plus portability. So everybody was kind of blown away by that. and then that's indexed for inflation every year. 2018 comes around, Republicans take a hold of the Congress and the presidency, and they pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They strike through that $5 million, change it to $10 million retroactively, increase them. So it's basically just caught up with the inflation as if it were $10,000 the whole time, if that makes sense. So now, adjusted for inflation, it's almost $13 million a person. And there's this concept called portability between spouses, right? So if I die and I'm only worth, $2 million, my spouse takes the $2 million, and she can actually port my $13 million exemption over to her for use later. And that's why they're concerned about these deathbed marriages when, for estate planning purposes, that folks would go and, pick up an unused exemption from somebody that's, on their deathbed. It's set to be cut in half. It's set to sunset in 2026. And just going back to that step up in basis thing, I mean, you talk about this exclusion. In my mind, everything is taxable, right? So you wrap up everything into tax. And then they say, okay, we're going to give you up to this much exclusion. And that's why you get sort of this conceptual step up in basis, because just like if you pay taxes on wages or something to that effect, that's post-tax dollars. These inheritances become post-tax dollars. So that's the way I make sense of it in my head. There's a couple of exceptions for if you're sitting out there going, if there's no tax on inheritance, but I got an inherited IRA, this next piece is for you. There's an exception for income in respect of a decedent. So retirement accounts like IRAs, annuities, things like that. Something that hasn't been taxed in the decedent's life that is going to be passed on to you, they generally want to tax. Uncashed bonds is one of those things that kind of comes up. Somebody's some mattress money, they got all these old treasury bonds, and they go cash them in at Wells Fargo, and then they give them a 1099 INT. That's income in respect of a decedent. And installment notes, because I want to touch down on this. How am I doing on time, Tom?
Depends on how many questions we have.
Okay, I'll jet through this piece right here. I want to get to those techniques, if nothing else, just for water cooler conversation.
Right. Stuff has been unpaid.
Right, exactly. Stuff that hasn't been paid tax. So that'll be subject to tax when you inherit it. Prop 19, Dax, you're going to go over that, right? So I'll just skip over that slide, and I want to jump into these kind of fun, if you will, potential techniques for trying to avoid taxes on the sale of your primary residence. There's this concept called an installment sale, where you essentially become a bank, right? So for properties that are already paid off or have a small mortgage, where the potential buyer, their down payment could wipe out the mortgage, you might be able to carry the note and act as the bank. So the reason the bank's never going to let you do that if they still have a note on the property, the deed of trust. So it has to be free and clear, essentially, whether it's after the down payment or it's already free and clear. And what this does is it defers the gains on the property. So there'll be a ratio, essentially, and the 121 exclusion comes into play here too, but there'll be a ratio of gain, right? So let's say that the property was sold for $1.5 million. Your basis is, after the 120 exclusion, everything else is $750,000. You have a 50% ratio there, 1.5 and 750. Every dollar you receive in down payment and principal, you will be paying that ratio that'll be your capital gain. So if, let's say you get 100 grand, $50,000 will be taxable. The way these after you get your down payment, assuming you get one, the way these amortization tables work is, if you've ever looked at one at when you sign your loan docs or anything, there's a lot of interest front loaded, right? And a lot of principal on the back end. So it serves to give you supplement your income in the form of interest income, and also defer capital gains taxes, maybe pick up a little bit more in those lower favorable capital gains tax rates. No step up in basis on the note, right? So that's income in respect of a decedent. So if you're thinking about stepping up basis and leaving as much as you can to your kids, you do an installment note, whether it's on your rental properties or your primary residence, that's not going to get a step up. So that's something you really have to think about. That's a big trade-off. Credit risk of somebody purchasing the property, something you have to think about. So like I say, there's strategies, but there's some pitfalls too. Consider renting the property. This is something that Tom had mentioned earlier. I mean, this is definitely something that is a technique. You know, there's high rental rates in town. You can enjoy the rental income, the deductions associated with it, including some depreciation, depending on how high your tax basis is. That's gonna correlate, right? If you have really low tax basis, you're not gonna get very much in the way of depreciation expense. You lose your eligibility for the 121 exclusion if you're not in there for 2 out of 5 years. So that clock kind of starts, you know, between years 1 and 3. After 3 years, you don't qualify anymore. After 3 years of renting the property, you're not going to have been in that property for 2 and 5 anymore. And one of the good things is it preserves a step up in basis if that's one of your goals. Qualitative concerns, I think, Tom, you wanted to touch on, which were very valid.
Yeah, if your desire is to simplify your lives, and having rental property isn't necessarily the best way to do that. I think it's only going to get harder to have rental property in California in the future. In terms of some of the landlord-tenant law issues, and one of the things that concerns me are things like new septic ordinance, sewer lateral ordinance, the possibility of there being a gas appliance ordinance where people are going to have to retrofit out and put in new electrical panels, electrical pieces of the house to compensate for the loss of gas appliance. All those are really big ticket items. And so you kind of got to maybe factor in some of those possible capital expenses that you're not expecting down the road. Your septic system can cost you $80,000. So, you know, that's going to wipe out a lot of that money that we're hoping on saving. And then the last thing I'll say about it is oftentimes, if you look at how much equity you have in the house, even if you have to pay some capital gains on it, the amount of rent that you're getting for that asset that's valued at that is not a very particularly good return in that basis. You know, your property. So it's something, all these things are things that
Yeah, good points. Go ahead.
I have a question on the installment sale section. If you have a single family home that you are renting out currently, can you still, if you're selling it, use the installment sale?
Yes, the one wrinkle there is they're going to want that depreciation recapture up front. So if you've been depreciating the property over the years, they're going to want you to pay that recapture tax, the capital gains tax on the recapture up front.
I understand. You can, if you have long-term capital gains, there's a provision that allows you to take that into the depreciation recapture. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one and the same. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Go ahead.
Second thing, renting property. Would it be right to say that if you're going to do it for less than 3 years, sell it, or plan on doing it for longer?
I would say so. Yeah, there becomes that sort of, you know, that fork in the road where you have to decide if you're all in and you want to be in it for long-term appreciation and benefits for rental, or you know, it's time to sell. And that's actually a really good segue into my craziest tax strategy for a primary residence that I can think of. That, you know, I actually have a client doing it this year, and this, I didn't even know you could do this when I started practicing. I think, you know, in 2014 or so, and somebody called me from Silicon Valley. They had this, Silicon Valley tends to be a little bit more wheeler dealer, and they also had the higher appreciation on their properties earlier, right? So if you're in Palo Alto, that kind of thing, you might have a $2.5 million 3-bedroom back then. So a guy calls me and says, "Can you do this?" I start researching it, and basically what I'm getting at here is combining two strategies: a 1031 exchange and the 121 exclusion that we talked about earlier. And the way that you do that, a 1031 exchange, for those of you who don't know, is basically you can trade even or up on business to business property, right? So your primary residence does not qualify for a 1031 exchange. So if you sell your primary residence, doesn't qualify. But if you rent your primary residence for a year or so, a year or more, I should say, now it's business property. And then I can do a 1031 exchange. And this is where it can kind of get interesting. You know, if I have a very large, you know, a lot of appreciation in my house, and I'm downsizing, maybe I can buy one house, maybe I can buy more houses, one or more houses, keep rentals. Again, you have to exchange into business property. So the house you purchase, whether that's your forever home, or it's a rental plus a forever home, you're going to have to rent that forever home portion for at least a year, because you got to go business to business. This is like a 2-year plus process. On top of that, so that can fund your retirement, especially if you buy a rental property and a new primary home that's technically a rental property too, until you convert it. But you can get a source of income from that piece, the rental property, and you can also pick up on the 121 exclusion, which is that 250K, 500K thing we were talking about, which usually for 1031 exchanges, if you trade down, then you're going to have to pay tax on whatever sort of cash you receive or forgiveness of debt, or debt pay down. So if I go from a $1.3 million home to a $1.2 million home, there's an oversimplification, but I'm going to have to pay that $100,000 is all going to be taxable gain. And it's not like a ratio like the installment sale. It all comes off taxable gain right off the top. So in this scenario, if you go business to business and do it with your primary residence, you can actually trade down. If you're single, $250,000. If you're married, $500,000. Use that cash to fund your retirement and potentially whatever other properties you invested in to fund your retirement as well.
You can find that murky thing about you 1031 a rental, but you kind of want to live in it pretty soon. How long does it have to be paying the rental property before you don't get covered?
I like to say at least a year, but they didn't define, some people say 6 months. I think they're crazy. If you talk to like this Coach 1031, like Tom Foster, this is one of the local guys in town, I think they like to go at least a year. Any questions?
Yeah, I've done that a few times. I was told 2 years, but a year is even better.
Okay.
On the other side. Question, when on this third option that you're outlining, I kind of lost you a little bit. Are you talking, it's like, so with her example and what I'm talking about is they turn it into a rental, they do a 1031, and then after so many years, they have the property again, and it becomes their primary.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they sold it, they can take advantage of the exclusion. But are you saying that you can take advantage of the 121 up front on the sale of what would then be a rental, or you even have to convert it to a rental?
You can take advantage of it up front. Yeah, that's my understanding. So that the 250K or 500K will come off the top. Yeah. This is something that's been scrutinized a little bit, but definitely more aggressive strategy.
You have to rent out the whole thing.
Ooh. I mean, it would all depend. I mean, if you're exchanging the whole thing, you'd have to rent. Maybe I don't understand your question. It's more like a qualitative, because this is what hangs people up is like, I don't want somebody in my house. I don't want to rent my house to somebody and have them destroy it. And this is where I get a lot of people going, no, I don't want anything to do with that strategy. So is that what you mean? Like maybe rent a room?
Right. Well, that happens a lot here. People want to rent out part of the home, or they want to, their ADU, or I don't know.
Yeah.
There's lots of different.
I would say, so because it's my concern would be, well, let's say that they 1031 into a property. They're not going to live in the property and say, okay, yeah, it's business property. My concern would be, that ADU or whatever they're renting, what's the rest of it? Is that personal use property? If it is, that's going to blow up the whole 1031. Is it investment property? That'd be more aggressive. So it's kind of facts and circumstances.
If I am understanding you correctly, it means that since you only have to occupy the house 2 out of the last 5 years, and if you wanted to do this both thing, you could rent the house for 2 years, and you would have been occupying it more than 2 out of the last 5,
right?
And then do the 1031 and get the both.
Correct. Yeah. So you're threading the needle for sure, because you have to your point, you have to have lived in the property for 2 and 5, and you also converted it to business property. So you really have kind of a tight window there to make all this happen, at least the first close of escrow. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Perfect.
My Tom. I just want to say that Tom Castillo's firm is open for business. So if you don't have a CPA, he'll welcome your face in his office.
Will you guys stick around, to answer some questions at the end and maybe talk with a few? You know, this is complicated. This is just one piece of the jigsaw puzzle or a couple of them. One of the things we heard in there is, you know, another one of those pieces is I recommend that everybody better visit their trust attorney as part of this process and make sure you have that dialed in. The trust attorneys don't understand the CPA stuff. There's things about trust that the CPAs don't understand. And so there's all these little silos of information. And it's worth it. This is a big enough change and transition in your life to, if you have to spend a little bit of money to go find the right answers and fit together these puzzles, it's worth it. It wouldn't make sense not to spend the money and get the right information. So we're going to we're going to switch over to Prop 19.
Yes. How do we do it?
Well,
Okay.
yeah, just email me. We'll be happy to send it to you. Yeah, or call or text, one of the ones. Okay, so I was remiss earlier. I did not introduce Natasha Mengay in the back, who is instrumental in setting us up here, and then my wife, Terry Brezsny, in the back. Good. And then here's Dax Nolenberger. We're very pleased to have him as a part of Brezsny Associates.
Thank you very much. I'll take the clicker.
Always the remote.
Yeah. Is anyone overwhelmed yet?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're going to be drunk on tax information by the time I'm done, or the wine in the back. So, as Tom mentioned, my name is Dax Nolenberger. I am a realtor with the Brezsny Associates team. My superpower, or I think my team would agree, is probably data and research. So when Tom asked me to present on Prop 19, I was actually kind of excited, which is shocking. I am not a CPA, and I am not a lawyer, so I'm going to lean on the Toms for any additional questions that you guys might have. I'll start my presentation by talking about a hypothetical situation. So let's say you bought your house in 1980. You have kids that grew up in the house and they have now left the nest, and you still own the home. And we'll say that they moved to a different county, like San Diego. And now they're starting to have kids and you want to be there. But there's a couple things that are holding you back. The first thing is the tax situation, capital gains, and the next is the property tax. In all likelihood, you have a really artificially low property tax. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you could sell your house here, take that property tax and move it to San Diego? Well, with Prop 19, that's what you can do. So that's a nice benefit. So what is Prop 19? Prop 19 allows homeowners 55 plus, severely disabled, or those whose home has been substantially damaged by wildfire or natural disaster to transfer their taxes to a new residence within the state. Before I dive too deep into Prop 19 and the benefits and the downsides, I'll give you a little bit of a history lesson to get where we are today. So before 1978, real property was appraised every 1 to 5 years, and that's actually how it is in most states in the US. Well, you can imagine what the issue would be with all the appreciation that we've seen since the early 80s if your property taxes was also raising at that rate. So in 1978, Prop 13 was passed, and what it did was it capped the property tax to 2% per year. In addition to that, properties were only reassessed on a change of ownership or when there's new construction. So I saw an example online about Warren Buffett. He bought in 1971 for $150,000 in the Laguna Beach area. He sold it in 2018 for $7.5 million. But according to the county assessor's records office, his property was worth $268,000. So he was paying property tax of $2,900, where the new owner was about to pay $75,000 a year. So moving on, 8 years, Another protection happened, Prop 58, and this passed in 1986. What it did was it brought in the exemptions for tax reassessments for the transfer between parents and children. You can obviously understand the benefit of that. If you saw all the appreciation occurring and your kids inherit the property, if it was reassessed, that might be a major issue. They might be forced to sell. So that's where Prop 58 comes in to protect the children. There's exemptions for any principal residence of any value in the first million of assessed value on non-residences. So it could be an apartment complex or a vacation home, a second home, or an office building. So that was an obviously nice benefit, especially for those in the state that owned multiple properties or apartment complexes, things like that. In the same year, Prop 60 and Prop 90 also passed. And what this allowed is sellers 55 plus to carry their low tax base on the original property to purchase new property of equal or lesser value. And that's the distinction right there, the equal or lesser value. Prop 60 allowed you to apply or to transfer within the same county. Prop 90 allowed you to transfer within different counties. The thing about Prop 90 was that counties had to opt in. So there was only 10 counties out of 58 in California that opted into this. So in all likelihood, if you moved to a different county, you were going to have to get a step up in basis. So this moves on to Prop 19. It passed in November of 2020. The major benefits are this. Qualifying sellers age 55 plus can carry their low tax basis to a new home up to 3 times, as opposed to 1 in the previous example. So if we're going back to the original example about moving to San Diego, you can move to San Diego, take your tax basis. If your kids decide to leave in 5 years, you can move again and take your tax basis. And you could do that a 3rd time in your lifetime. So that's a huge benefit for people that want to be able to move within the state. In addition to that, you can now transfer your tax basis anywhere within the state, or before it was just specific counties. And then lastly, you can transfer your tax basis to a greater value, where before it was just a property of equal or lesser value. So let's look at an example of that. So let's say you're buying a couple sells a home with an assessed value of $250,000, and they sell it for $1 million fair market value. That same couple buys a new home for $1.5 million. So their new tax basis would be that $250,000 original assessed value, plus the difference between the house they sold and the new house that they bought. In this case, it's $500,000. So their new tax basis would be $750,000. That's obviously better than the tax basis if it were $1.5 million. You're paying half the amount of property taxes. So let's say you want to buy down. This happens quite frequently. Same situation, you have an assessed value of $250,000 and you sell your house for $1 million for fair market value. Maybe you want to put some money aside, or you have some capital gains that you have to pay, and you buy a new house for $750,000. Your new tax basis will still be that original $250,000. Breaking it down into math, the value of that is at $250,000 if your property tax is 1.25%. Your yearly rate is $3,125. Alternatively, if you didn't get this benefit and you bought that house for $750,000, it would be $9,000. So $6,000 benefit. So there's a lot of nice benefits to Prop 19. There are some downsides though, and the county, the state is actually generating a ton of revenue from this bill because they restricted Prop 58. They're getting hundreds of millions of dollars a year because of it. So what it does is it restricts this parent-child exclusion, and here's how. Before Prop 19, you could take your primary residence of any value, no matter how much it appreciated, and you could pass it down to your kids with no reassessment. They'd still continue to pay that abnormally low property tax. In addition to that, if you had a second home or an apartment complex or an office building or a vacation home, you could transfer up to $1 million in assessed value to your kids without them getting a reassessment. So let's say, for example, you had a vacation home that was assessed at $500,000. It's now worth $1.5 million. That $1 million is protected. So they would pay no additional property taxes. That was before Prop 19. After Prop 19, now there are restrictions on how much of the appreciation you can take, basically. So if you have a primary residence, you can take the current assessed value plus the additional 1 million in fair market value, so that $1 million in appreciation, and you can pass it down to your kids. The problem now is that a child has to live in the house as primary residence. And if you have adult children, in all likelihood, they have their own primary residence. So the only option for them to maintain that low property tax is to move into the house. If they don't move into the house, it's automatically reassessed. If they move into the house and then decide to move out 2 years later, it'll be reassessed at that point. They have to apply for a homeowner's exemption. So that's an obviously restrictive issue if you're trying to transfer your primary residence to your children without getting reassessed. After Prop 19, so any non-primary residence, whether it's a vacation home, a second home, an apartment complex, an office building, automatically reassessed. You can't get any benefit in terms of a lower property tax if you inherit the property as a child. So some frequently asked questions. Do you need to sell or buy first? It does not matter. You can buy first and then sell, or you can sell first and then buy. The only thing that matters is you have to do it within 2 years. What's the time frame? 2 years. When do I need to file buy? You need to file within 3 years. So when you have that first transaction, whether it's a buy or a sell, you have 2 years to identify the property, an additional year to file. What if only one of the spouses is 55 plus? You're eligible. Only one of the spouses needs to be over 55. What if my property is a multi-unit? This is where it gets interesting, especially if you're an investor. So the parent or the person passing down the property, they have to live in one of the units as a primary residence, and they have to pass it down to their kids, who then have to live in one of the units as a primary residence. The other half is reassessed. So let's say, for example, you have a $2 million duplex. They're identical on both sides. You can get the benefit of that $1 million on one side. The other half is automatically reassessed. Will I get refunded while waiting for my claim? Yes, you will. The processing time takes, well, depending on the county, takes quite a long time. So it could take, 6 to 9 months to a year. You will get refunded for the difference between what you're paying in property tax with the lower rate. Unless I pass in order to transfer ownership and have my kids receive the tax exclusion. No, you don't need to. You can sell the house to your kids or gift it to them. They can take on that lower tax rate, but you can't double dip. So you can't sell to your kids and then move to San Diego and try to take that lower property tax rate. So only one person can take it. How do I apply? So the process, you have to buy and sell before you apply for this exemption. Once you do both, you have essentially a year to do that, and you would go to your county's assessor's office, file a claim in the county that you bought the property. That's all I got. Any questions? Yes.
I don't have children. What about nieces and nephews?
It's only your children.
Every
Yep.
biological children. Okay.
And it could be a grandparent to a child, but the parents of the child have to have passed.
You can't buy things.
Yeah, bypass. Right.
That last thing, do you have to file in the county that you live in? Is that what you said?
Yeah, the question was, do you have to file in the county that you live in? It's the county that you bought the property when you're transferring. Yes.
Make sure I understand. So my house is in a trust, and I die, if my kids inherit that house, it will be assessed.
Unless they live in it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
If they live in it as their primary residence, it's not reassessed.
It's interesting, the capital gains and property tax, sometimes it all gets mixed up together, because they're both complicated in a different way. The other thing I would say is when you file for the reduction after you buy in whatever county that would be, every once in a while, people try and sort of trick the system, and they'll try and do a little private deal off to the side with the seller of the property, and they'll try and maneuver the numbers to keep their property tax lower. The assessor's office, the appraisers in the assessor's office, they're kind of like the dictators of that judgment. And if they don't agree with what you bought the property for based on what you sold, they don't have to accept it. And so you want to just be careful that you're not trying to kind of shove the round peg in the square hole and trying to force it a little bit. You want to be they have supreme judgment over these things. So if you're trying to be tricky, be careful. Any other property tax questions?
Just one point, I mean, when your kids go to live in your house, there are limitations as far as, like, if you have a $5 million house, there are limitations as far as what you can do. Currently it's like $1 million, let's say you have $500,000 assessment. The way that it works is if you got 500,000, you got $1 million to it, with a $5 million house, that $1.5 million would reduce the new assessment. So the new assessment said $5 million would be $3.5 million. So there are limitations to how much your kids can take on tax-free.
When you started, you had Prop 19. Is that the same as the Prop 19 after 1986? The 2020 Prop 19? Because we used to repeat numbers on propositions.
Sure. So Prop 19 passed in November of 2020. The one from 86 is Prop 60 and 90.
Okay, so when you talked about Prop 19 at the beginning of your talk, it was the 2020 Prop 19.
Yes.
Yeah, there is another Prop 19, I believe, but it had something to do with pornographic films, if I'm not mistaken. Little bit odd, and yeah, we're geezers. It's not going to happen. One reflection I have is there's in this third act we're talking about. There's an actuarial aspect to this, and there's sometimes the idea of avoiding tax is so strong, it's so imprinted in us. We'll do anything to not pay capital gains tax or to not pay a higher property tax, to the extent that some people actually choose to live in a place that they know isn't healthy for them and isn't making them happy because they don't want to pay higher property taxes. And if you're 85 and you figure your longevity is maybe another 10 years and you're not moving to a place that would be a healthier environment for you because you were worried about paying another $10,000 a year in property tax, well, do the numbers. Is $100,000 for that last 10 years of your life? How important is that when juxtaposed with quality of life concerns? So all of these things are complicated. It's an interesting thing. So I'm gonna under the pieces of the puzzle, capital gains, property tax, and I encourage everybody to do the trust
and a state piece of it as well. If you get the compass direction on those things, it'll make it easier for you to kind of think through and transition through the quality of life questions. Because so often what people are really stuck with is that inability to face that transition, because it's scary, because nobody likes change. And the foolproof excuse is Prop 19 or capital gains. And, that's always a ready excuse. So on some level, to downsize successfully, we have to hack our own selves and our own habits. We have to trick ourselves. And one of the ways just by, what I mean tricking is just give up some of our assumptions or question our own assumptions. So the more information you have, the easier it becomes to deal with some of those emotional aspects of the move, of changing in your life at 65 or 75 or 85 or 95. Great. Does anybody have more questions for?
What's that?
Oh, that's the special. Okay, so there are. Thank you. It's interesting because some people have been calling me about these talks, and some people, for them, downsizing means one thing: getting rid of their stuff.
Yeah.
All the other stuff, none of it matters. I'm just swimming in stuff. So next week, next Wednesday, same time, same station, we're going to talk about stuff. We're going to have some professional packers and organizers and people that do that for a living come and talk to us about stuff. And I decided what I was going to do. We'll do a little lottery next time. And if you win the lottery, we're going to give you some free time for packers and organizers to come to your house and work with you. Just to give you a taste of what that's like, because it's, we've watched them many times. They're not as scary and sometimes when you get started, it gets easier. It's just it's the inertia part of it. Bernard. I don't know. I think last I've heard, Marie Kondo is she had 2 or 3 kids and is no longer talking about the magic of tidying up. And when it comes to extreme hoarders or some of us in this room, Marie Kondo doesn't stand a chance. She can't help us. We need more help than that. So Tom and Alan are going to stick around for a little bit afterwards. And, with all this stuff, if you have questions, if you want to get the slide presentations, just let us know. We're happy to help. If you have stuff that's really unique to you, call us. And we're happy to talk you through it if we can. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, just because you're talking about this puzzle piece in the silo. So this was awesome. I missed last week. Next week, I think I have to be in board meeting, so I'll miss it. But you're giving us this gift of starting to think about these things, no matter what stage we're at. But how, for instance, I could get a hold of you, or I could get a hold of you, or I could get a hold of you, and those are still kind of silos unless there's something that's tying it all together and making sense. Do you have any advice about how to go about that?
Well, I mean, it's partly what our mission is. Yes, we're realtors, but for us, I think I said this the first night. We don't sell homes. We facilitate life transitions. So for me, ever since I got in the business, my dream that I had was that there would be some complex of buildings or like an office like this. And in that room over there would be a CPA. In that room over there'd be an estate attorney. That room over there'd be, someone that understood Prop 13. And so people could come and do a one-stop shop. And you need a holistic approach to it. And it's almost, society isn't set up, the culture isn't set up to do that. It's all separate little, for those of you that have lost a parent in the recent years, that weird place of being where you're grieving, you're trying to come to terms with the emotional aspects of this. And yet, you're forced into the position where you're dealing with trusts and, social security and burial arrangements and all this business, thing. And to try and fit all that together is just maddening. It's crazy making. So part of the proactiveness about this, or what we're trying to do, we're all, on some degree, we're all on the continuum. We're all wrestling with some or all of these questions. So how do we start to put together the pieces, identify what the pieces are, and then step back from that? And, part of it is looking at what you're willing to, is testing your own assumptions. Are you that person who isn't going to move for any reason because they don't want to pay a higher property tax? Well, that's a choice and that's fine. But, so that answers the question for them. But if you look at that pro and con, trade-off aspect, and are you sufficiently interested and excited about the change, the next chapter and the next step? Can you view it as an adventure, or is it a punishment somehow that we have to downsize? And I would posit that if you can see all the good things about that, and those are pulling you towards that place, it's much easier to let go. If you're being pushed all the way because you've got health challenges or you need a single level, but you're really not focused in on what the bigger benefits are for doing the downsizing, you're never going to make it. Frankly, most people, it's a miracle if they make it through the stuff part of it. Yeah.
In answer to your question too, it really helps to use associated professionals. So in other words, whoever you choose to use, ask who they recommend for that other silo, because they can back channel, and then you don't have to tell your whole story to 3 different people who may hear parts and not hear other parts. That I know for the people we work with, we can share, and what we know about your personality, how you receive information. It really smooths it out if you work with linked professionals as opposed to 3 completely different people.
And people that want to work collaboratively in that way. There's some
trust attorneys that really don't care. My piece is the trust. I don't care what else happens. Or my piece are the taxes. I don't care what else happens. If they're service oriented, that's what it's about. It's about the people and their lives, and it's not moving from one house to another. It's getting from one place in your life to the next place. The house is just a small part of it. Can you achieve that bigger transition gracefully and smoothly and navigate all this, because it isn't easy at all. Oh, I guess we're done, and feel free to come up and ask questions if you have them, and next week you can win 3 hours with a stager or with a packer and organizer. Thanks for coming, everybody. Appreciate it.